Does she know that?
Yeah, she already knew that. That was one of my 75 emails that I was trying to read while I was in the school.
God bless you. Yeah, I'm sure you had a busy afternoon with that.
I'm walking time. It's awesome.
Watershed Association and the Brodhead Chapter of Trout Unlimited. My name is Eric Baird. I'm the president of the Brodhead Chapter of Trout Unlimited. And before we get to our feature presentation this evening, I'd like to take a couple of minutes, just give you a couple of quick announcements, and then there'll be a couple of other individuals, but then we'll get the main show on. First, for Brodhead Chapter Trout Unlimited, this Saturday on April 13th, we are assisting with the Knights of Columbus Children's Fishing Contest at Broadhead Park from 6 a.m. to 11 a.m. If anyone's interested in helping, you can come see me after the meeting. I'll give you more details on that. On Sunday, April 14th, I'd like to announce that the Pocono Heritage Land Trust is holding a walk on the Cranberry Creek from 1 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. For more information on that, go to phlt.org. On Wednesday, April 17th, we are having our first Project Healing Waters fishing event of the year. That is from 9 a.m. till 3 p.m. And if you're interested in that, please see Glenn Lippincott there in the back. He will give you a lot more information on that. That's a program that helps veterans heal through fly fishing. So if anyone knows a veteran or is interested in helping, please see Glenn. Okay. On Wednesday, April 17th, I got that one. Sorry, missed that one. Okay, April 27th, we are going to be having a booth at Earth Day, and we are looking for some volunteers from the chapter to help organize that booth. If you would be interested, you can see me after the meeting. That's from, I believe, 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. on Saturday, April 27th. Then on Sunday, April 28th, we are holding an introduction to fly fishing at Pocono Environmental Education Center. And if anyone would like to help out with that, you can see me. If you're interested in maybe taking the class, I can get you information on that. You'll see me after the meeting. On Saturday, May 4th, we are having our annual chapter cleanup in Tannersville. We'll be meeting at the ball fields behind the township building and cleaning up the Learn and Preserve, the PHLT Park on the Pocono Creek, and around the ball fields, and I believe it's Bisbing Rung. So we've held this will be our third year doing this, and we've moved a lot of trash in the last 3 years. Okay, last one is Wednesday, May 8th. Our general meeting is back here. It's going to be maybe not here, out there. We're meeting on the creek. We're going to have a night of fishing and camaraderie, so please show up. We'll be kicking off around 6:30 p.m. So if you're interested, that is Wednesday, May 8th. And now I'm going to turn it over.
June 20th, introduction to fly fishing. Here, details will be announced. That will be done in coordination, in partnership with Brodhead Watershed Association and Pocono Heritage Land Trust. July 6th, Women's Intro to Fly Fishing. If you fly fish before and you want to learn more, if you don't even know what a fly rod is, that's also going to be here in partnership with the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission as well as the Brodhead Watershed Association. So look for more information coming up with these events.
All right, so now I'm going to turn over the meeting to Bob Howell of the Brodhead Watershed Association for any announcements from the BWA. Take it away, Bob.
Okay, thank you, Eric. I'll try not to destroy your microphone here. So anyway, my name is Bob Heil. I'm the Executive Director of the Brodhead Watershed Association. The Brodhead Watershed Association is a nonprofit organization that works to make sure the water is clean in the entire Brodhead Watershed. So Brodhead Watershed, to really simplify it, is the eastern half of Monroe County. From the headwaters up above Skytop, to down near Shawnee or Delaware Water Gap where the Broadhead flows into the Delaware River, all the water in between there, which includes areas such as the Marshalls Creek, Paradise Valley, Pocono Creek, McMichaels Creek, and Cherry Valley all flow into that. So we are an organization that is always working in various ways possible to educate people about the importance of clean water, take action when necessary, sometimes applaud DEP, sometimes prod DEP, whatever is the appropriate methodology to keep our waters clean. So we are now, as of November, based in this beautiful building. Our offices are right out here and down the hall. So if you have any questions or issues, this is where to find us. We also have, of course, a website, a Facebook page, and all that kind of stuff. So we work every day to keep the water clean, and we have many of the same goals as Trout Unlimited and Pocono Heritage Land Trust and others, and we all do our part to collaboratively make this stuff happen. So when Eric gave you the list of events, I was like, wow, we have a lot of events too. And his list already overwhelmed my mind. But what we are doing is April 20th here, Daryl Spiker is going to talk about eagles and then walk you to an eagle nest and maintain appropriate eagle nest etiquette. That's a good one. Every environmental organization will be at Earth Day on April 27th, and it's really good because it's at NCC Monroe campus, and in one big circle you can find all these great organizations. Probably Master Gardeners might be there, and all kinds of great stuff going on. So, native plant sale, the end of May, that's a lot of enthusiasm. Be a member to get there early and buy the best plants, usually deer-proof, not quite guaranteed, but almost guaranteed to survive, depending on how good of a gardener you are. So all this list is really overwhelming. So the way to not be overwhelmed is to basically be a member of BWA, and then we will get you you'll be on our email list and our newsletter list, and you'll know everything that's going on. So that's pretty much the majority of things. I wanted to just introduce the organization. Many of you know who we are, but there might be some of you who don't know who we are. But if there's a water question, people ask us if they can't get a hold of the DEP or Fish and Boat or whoever else is out there. If you ask us where to go fishing, I'm going to tell you call Trout Unlimited. But it's just part of the partnership here. So that's pretty much what I have. I'll be around here the whole night. I just want to say that I'm really excited that we were able to get Dr. Huzik as a speaker when the Climate Change Committee formed, and they went through a big brainstorming session behind the scenes looking for the right speakers. I said a number of years ago, I went to one of the bio-colloquiums, which is a little seminar that Dr. Sandy Whitten, Terry Masters, and others put together over at ESU, and I really was impressed with Dr. Huzik's speech. And so I'm looking forward to tonight. sorry I'm saying the expectations high, but it was very good. And I really appreciated that. So that's the story from here. I guess I'm handing this off to Todd Burns, a guy who is spending a lot of time fishing nowadays.
It's great.
You're really grinning.
Retirement is good.
Your grin is contagious.
Get me all wired up here.
Take your time to get wired.
Okay, good evening. My name is Todd Burns. I'm the Secretary and Advocacy Chair of the Brodhead chapter of Trout Unlimited. And I'm just going to walk you through a couple of things that are going on in the national and state governments right now that deal with clean water and clean water protections, and also in the state especially, bills that are being pushed through the House Environmental Energy Resources Committee that would decrease the ability of the regulatory agencies to do what they've been designed to do, which is regulate without interference from the legislature. So I just want to walk through that quickly. The replacement rule, as it's called, is on a national level where they're looking to roll back protections from the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act was put into place and has resulted in a myriad number of streams becoming so much cleaner and so much better, not only for fishing, but also for recreation and those types of things, whether you kayak or canoe, whether you just like to have your grandkids walk around the creek in sneakers and catch salamanders, whatever. What they're trying to do is the way the rules are rewritten is they're getting rid of protections for those nice ephemeral streams and small ponds that are there in the springtime and help filter out the winter materials that come down through, and also provide life for the new forms coming through. So the salamander ponds, the tree frog ponds, the peepers that just started peeping about 2 weeks ago in that nice first 40-degree night when it rained and it's almost too loud. Those protections they're looking to roll them back. But you can comment on that. And if you want to know where to comment, you simply go to, you don't have to be a Trout Unlimited member. You can go just to tu.org and go to their main webpage, and where it says Get Involved, follow the menu, and you can take action. And this one says Protect Our Headwaters and Streams. And you just simply, they already have a pre-written message in there. You can add your own comments in addition to that. You simply log in, put in your email, your address, tell them what you think, hit send, and it's there. And it gets sent out. Okay, so that's on the national level. That's an important one that affects us all locally because of the nice, wonderful streams we have in here, our Pocono waters, if you will. So that's one I need to make you aware of. So advocate for clean water. Then we have the state. Ah, yes, Pennsylvania House of Representatives. There are multiple bills there, and I'm just going to go through them briefly and quickly. There's a Bill 430, a Bill 509. They didn't waste any time, by the way. 509, there's a Bill 762, and then House Bills 806 and 507. I do not expect you to remember all those numbers, but I would urge you, if you need those numbers, you can contact me. I'll get my emails out there. But basically what they do, I'm just going to read 806 and 507. House Bill 806 would give either the House or the Senate effective veto power over the promulgation of almost all new regulations. So you have a regulatory agency that makes regulations, but it would have to then all be totally approved by either the House or the Senate. Any new regulation would need to be approved by both the House and the Senate within 10 legislative days. They can't come up with a budget in 2 years, but they're going to do that in 10 days. Sorry for the sarcasm, but that's the truth. I'm no longer a public employee, so I guess I can speak more freely now. Senate within 10 legislative days or 30 calendar days, whichever is longer. So it could be up to 30 calendar days if there's a recess in there. Basically what it does is it makes it difficult for the executive branch using the existing legal and statutory authority to develop new regulations. House Bill 507 and House Bill 06 give the House and Senate effective veto power on those regulations, and it would need to be approved. And I believe in one of these, it's veto-proof for the governor. The governor cannot veto it. So I would urge you to look into that. It's in the House Environmental and Energy Committee. Is that the name of it? It's an interesting mix. It's an interesting juxtaposition. It's the energy, which is where all the emphasis is going, and the environment is getting pushed down to the bottom. At least that's my opinion. So we'd urge you to contact your members of the House and or Senate and let them know how you feel on those bills. Again, my email, I can make that available if you want to get a little overview of what's going on here. So I just want to bring you up to speed on that because those are all very important things for water, and we're here because we believe in clean water and the wonderful things that we can do with clean water in the Poconos. Again, whether it's from the top of the plateau, as you're coming down the plateau, or as you're canoeing down the Delaware River headed towards Easton. Okay, we really need protections on the water, so I'd encourage you to take any actions you can, and I thank you.
One more you missed here.
Well, go ahead.
Okay. On Thursday, April 18th, monthly board meeting of Monroe County Conservation District. It's probably our most important local regulatory body, and I encourage anyone who can attend to attend those meetings. It's at 8 a.m. at the Conservation District. Thank you, Todd.
You're welcome.
Ann Foster.
For those of you who know me, I wear many hats. One of them is a Brodhead Watershed Association hat, and one is a Brohead Trout Unlimited hat, and another is a Monroe County Master Gardener hat, and I see members from all organizations and the general public here today, so welcome everyone. It's this cooperative effort and partnership amongst organizations in Monroe County that make our area so unique and special as far as protecting our waters and our environment. I want to thank Bob Heil for suggesting Dr. Husick here today as a speaker. I did see her presentation via the Master Watershed Program, and I was equally impressed. Opening day of trout season is coming up this weekend, so we thought this would be an appropriate time to bring a presentation such as this to our area. This is the second in the Brodhead Watershed Association's speaker series on climate change. We realize that we can no longer delegate climate change to the back of the shelf. We need to have it out front and be talking about it because its impacts aren't going to be restricted to glaciers. The impacts are also going to be or to Houston or to Miami. The impacts are to Cuba. The impacts we're going to see that here. Maybe not as dramatic, but we're going to see and are likely already seeing some of those impacts. And our mission is to protect, educate, and help protect the environment in our watershed. So we need to start addressing it and get the conversation going. The third in our speaker series will be on July 13th right here in the Broadhead Creek Heritage Center. Ed Perry of the National Wildlife Federation will be speaking on climate change and its impacts on wildlife. He's gone out and he's spoken to many organizations in Pennsylvania. He's happily bringing it here to the Broadhead Watershed. So that also, you'll be seeing more information coming out about that. Mark your calendar. That's also going to be a very good presentation. About Dr. Diane White-Husick, who is Dean of the School of Natural and Health Sciences at Moravian College. She's also a trained biochemist. So the scientists, and I know we have many in the room, will be quite impressed and interested in this. She's taught environmental sciences, conservation biology, sustainability, and climate change. Her research, and I found this interesting being born and raised in the area, her research focused on the restoration of a contaminated site, the Palmerton Superfund site, and I know some of you are familiar with that area, and also research on the impact of climate change on the Appalachian landscape. Her interests are communicating environmental issues to the public and engaging the public in citizen science. That's also something that Trout Unlimited is interested in. They're also utilizing citizen science programs. One thing to point out about Trout Unlimited very quickly is we're not just a fishing club. We are an environmental organization who are here to protect our cold waters so we can fish. Without rambling on too much more, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Husick. Thank you so much. Russ, does she need this?
Do I need? Okay.
Thank you.
Let's see, I didn't bring a pocket. So thank you very much for the invitation. Is there a clip on here? Yeah, there should be. Oh, it's way down. I get animated when I'm talking, so. Can you hear me? Okay. So thank you for the invitation, and now I'm really nervous because of all of that billing that I'm supposed to be good. Anyway, yeah, let me get started. First of all, I grew up in Michigan, but I've been in Pennsylvania I think longer now, and some of my fondest memories as a child was spending time with my father fishing, and it's something I actually really miss. But trout in Michigan is a great thing, either the lake trout in Big Lake Superior or the small trout that are in the streams. So, all of that depressing news about the legislation and the proposed bills. And I'm going to start out with a list of things that are even more depressing. And hopefully by the end it won't be so depressing, okay? But you all know that there's a number of threats or challenges that we're facing. Whether it's a loss of habitat, and I work in the Lehigh Valley, but I live in Monroe County, and to see down there the sprawl, the loss of farmland, the distribution centers, it's just really frustrating because I swear every day there's a new one going in. You've probably heard about the decline in biodiversity, and that doesn't matter which species you're looking at. I'm a plant scientist by training. The predictions are by 2050 we could lose 68% of our global species of plants. But the same is true if you pick mammals and birds and so on. You get a lot of information about the colony collapse disorder and the pollinators in general in decline, whether you're talking bats or butterflies or bees. And you know, if nothing else, even if we don't care about these things in terms of our ecosystems, we should worry about our food supply. And then climate change is one of the reasons I'm here tonight, and all of the things that will layer on top of these other problems. And then environmental pollution and that whole issue of lessening the regulations is something that we really should keep an eye on, not only for the environment, but our own human health. So all of these issues, you could just kind of say, well, we might as well just go home and forget it, but that's not a good approach. And so one of the things I talk to students about is, well, I wouldn't be up here if I didn't think there's something we can do. And one of the things, especially with my students, is telling them to disconnect for a few minutes and actually get outside and pay attention to what's going on around them. And it's amazing what we can learn if we actually do that. So all of you are people that spend time outdoors. You're probably very aware of what changes either seasonally or what's changing more longer term. So one of the things, what can nature tell us about environmental change, and what questions should we be asking? And that's what I want to focus on, and a little bit about what information you can provide to scientists and what we can do about once we have that information. So it's a little bit scrunched up at the top. I want to talk a little bit about phenology, and essentially this is the science that allows us to look at things that happen naturally during different seasons, different events during the year, and understand how environmental things change those events. And I'll make more sense when I give you some examples. But this is a word that was derived from two Greek words. Pheno is to show or to appear, and logos is to study. So all of like biology and geology and stuff, that OGY in the end is the idea of studying. But you have a more intuitive sense of this. Spring is, I think, arriving, right? And how do we know? Flowers are starting to show. What else? Birds. Tree buds. Birds. Definitely the birds are coming back. Temperature changing, a little bit warmer. Nice. We all know these kinds of things, the migration, the leaf buds, all of these things that happen on a regular basis. And spring is really exciting because we really notice it after a long, gray, dreary winter. But each of the seasons will come with their own. In the fall, the color season, and so on. Okay? So those are phenological events. And the timing of those can tell us an awful lot about things in nature. They have a lot of importance to us as well. So from a scientific perspective, those events are really important in understanding ecology, and I'll come back to that point a little bit later. But if you're a farmer, you care about these timings. When's the last frost? When's the first frost? Because that affects what you do in your fields. Gardeners, the same thing. Health and safety, and I posted the description of this talk tonight, and somebody said, oh, you're going to talk about allergies. Well, it's really important because birch pollen comes out, and some people are allergic. Ragweed comes out late in the summer, another phenological event, and some people have allergies to that. Heat stroke and a whole bunch of things can be linked to phenological events. Recreation. When's our ski season? When is it time to go and look at the flowers? If you're going on hikes, looking for spring ephemerals. A couple weeks ago, that first warm rain where people were out in the Delaware Water Gap looking for salamanders and frogs crossing the roads and so on. And cultural events like the Cherry Festival in Washington, D.C. And all of these things we believe are being impacted by climate change. It's amazing if you look through history how many poets and writers actually talked about phenology, but in a much more artistic way than scientists usually do. But Thoreau was one of these people where he talks on a lot of his records in a very poetic way about, especially winter to spring. We really like that transition. And I'll come back to Thoreau in a little bit. Phenology is probably one of the oldest forms of environmental science. There are records in the Asian cultures that go back before Christ, or in the Japanese culture about 900 AD, where they paid attention to the cherry blossoms because the cherry blossom is a part of their culture and their philosophy. The idea that it's rejuvenation, it's a time to not only have spring come, but it's a time to change things in your life. And so it's very hooked up to their culture. And so they had festivals, and you can go back in the records and see when their festivals were because you knew that was the peak of the bloom time and track that. And some people have done that. This is for Kyoto, Japan, and actually the little symbols are little teeny cherry blossoms, but I don't think you can see it in here. But and then so this is about 800 AD, and you see that up and down. This is April-ish, and then this is March, and this is May. And so they track through the records when the bloom times, and typically with any spring, there's a lot of variation. It depends on what happens in terms of the months preceding. But one thing to notice here is starting around 1800, so about the time we started using fossil fuels, you see this downward trend in this graph, and I'm going to talk about that a couple times tonight. That means things are happening earlier. So we're going from April towards March, so that means the peak of the bloom time has come earlier in more recent times. Okay? We do that. This is the National Park Service's cherry blossom peak blooms in Washington, D.C., and they actually have a definition for this. The cherry trees were planted in 1912, 1917, but they have records going back to several decades. And each of these dots is what was the peak bloom time for that year. And I added, because for this chart, these are the last 2 years. This year, it was April 1st. And if you look at the long-term trend, it's again going down, not as dramatically as the one I just showed you, but that actually represents about a week earlier on average that the Cherry Blossom Festival in DC happens. People like Linnaeus, who gave us the Latin names for things, the dichotomous keys, some Belgian scientists going back to the 1800s, they were talking about this idea of phenology, but they didn't call it that. But they were keeping track of things in their notebooks. And it was a paper then in the 1850s that came out and talked about these phenomena that happen on a periodic basis. And the term phenology came out not long after that. Jefferson, in his gardens at Monticello, kept really great records. And the person by the name of Robert Marsham, who in the 1700s was doing this, and actually in his big estate, keeping track of what he called the 27 indications of spring. And the reason I mention it is these notebooks that go back a couple hundred years provide us a window into what was happening previously. We can look at the same species today and see if they're behaving similarly. Okay? And so this estate is interesting because the family descendants actually kept those records until the 1950s, and now there's a nonprofit group that goes to the estate and keeps these same records. And they've, like, this is a snowdrop, they've kept track of what happens to when they bloom and so on. And in our area, this is one of the earliest blooming plants. Mine stopped blooming a couple weeks ago, but they can sometimes in the Lehigh Valley be out in January if we don't have snow cover. So I mentioned Thoreau, and he kept great records when he was sitting out in his cabin by his woods, or in the woods. And a group of scientists that are at Harvard, which is not a bad institution, decided to look at his records and also Natural History Museum records. So if you think about when people take flower samples and they press them for botanical specimens or herbarium specimens, they pick them at the peak of the bloom and they write the date down. And so they took those records and Thoreau's records and then current observations and compared them. And by the way, it got published in the Proceedings of National Academy of Science, which is one of the most prestigious journals in the country. And so they have these data from Thoreau, and then later some other scientists, and then more recently. And what they found, also looking at temperature change, is that in the Northeast, in the Boston or Massachusetts area, on average, there's been about a 2.5 degree increase Celsius over that time period. Okay? And what they found is that things were either blooming at least a week earlier over that time period, or the plant species were in decline. And their kind of summary was, plants are going to have to either learn to adapt to these earlier springs, or they're going to basically die out. Okay? And we know that in the Northeast, the early advance of spring is coming. The farther up you go in latitude, the more dramatic it is. Okay. Leopold, on his places in Wisconsin, also did this kind of record keeping. His family, his descendants, kept those records going for a long period of time, and the same sort of thing. You see an overall temperature increase, especially in the spring, and they know that things are blooming about a week earlier there as well. Now, we have all kinds of statements about whether it's from farming or things of when we do things together. Mine is, I have this wonderful rose that always blooms around the 4th of July, and I can guarantee the day before the flowers open, the Japanese beetles come out. always. So those rose flowers are never perfect. They're always chewed up. You know, that's one of my combinations. But there's a number of these kinds of things that happen. Forsythia are starting to bloom. I don't know if they're up here. I live in Kunkletown. They just sort of came out the last 2 days. It's time to do your roses because they're starting to leaf out and you want to prune them now if you want to get a good bloom, if any of them are left because of the wilt or the virus that's taken over a lot of the roses. Oops, back here. But anyway, the importance of record keeping, and I don't mean the scientific type that I do in the lab with my students or during my research. People take notes in all kinds of ways, and those journals, whether they're gardening journals, whether they're notebooks that fishermen keep about what they're going to put on their tie on their lines, are really important sources of data. And sometimes they're really beautiful. People can sketch. Mine are usually scribbled in all these loose pieces of paper because I got something in my pocket and I put them in a pile. And sometimes this gardener actually writes the first day of his daffodil blooms on his gardening shed. He just paints them on there. Not exactly what they teach you in a science class, but not bad, okay? And this happened over the weekend. This is in front of my barn. And the daffodils opened up, and I always jot that date down. But if I look next to my barn, which is white and self-facing and reflects the sun, those daffodils bloom a lot earlier than the ones elsewhere in my yard. So a single person's information may not be important, even if it's over time. But if you get a lot of people looking at the first time they see their daffodils in their yard, year after year, what you see are some trends that are in common at different places. And that is what phenology is kind of doing, is looking at groups of records over a long period of time and seeing if we see any changes. This one's kind of messy, doesn't tell us very much. But this was done, there's a great big phenology group in the UK, and looking at, this is May and going down to March. This is 1950 to the early 2000s, and this was an oak leaf that people were monitoring. And as this goes down, this trend line, this means that the leaves were budding out earlier in the spring. And that's a fairly obvious trend downward, or a more early spring. So just briefly, I want to intercept here. When we talk about climate change, we're talking about long-term trends. So we are in a temperate zone. We have 4 seasons. If you live in the tropics, you have 2 seasons, wet and dry. Okay, that's climate. Weather is what you get on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so we're going to be talking a little bit about these climate change, these long-term trends. And just real briefly, the idea of we have solar radiation that comes into the Earth's surface. It warms up the planet. We're loving it because the sun's getting higher, and you can feel it now. In the summer, if you stand on blacktop, you know how much heat is basically coming to the Earth's surface because it absorbs by that dark color, and you stand out and you can burn your feet if they're bare. Okay? Or if you're in the car, that sunlight comes through your windows in the summer, don't leave your babies or pets, okay? Because it gets really hot inside. That greenhouse effect, that warming from the solar radiation, is actually essential for our Earth to survive, for life to survive on Earth. At night, sun goes down, cooling occurs, but because we have an atmosphere of certain gases, it acts like a blanket to hold some of that heat closer to the Earth's surface. And that's important. However, if we put more and more gases into that layer that are going to act as like putting extra covers on at night, we don't want it to heat too much, and that's what we're tending to do. Okay? And so anytime people talk about climate change, you'll often see graphs like this, and I don't think this is the way to communicate with the public, but I'm going to mention it anyway. Okay? This is George Keeling was the person who did the first direct measurements of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere starting in 1958. And what you see is every year, and I took this about a month ago, you see this rise in CO2 in the atmosphere, and you see this cyclic pattern. It goes up and down. It goes down in the summer. Any ideas why? Plants. And I'm doing photosynthesis is one of the reasons. It's higher in the winter because there's no photosynthesis, but what else is happening in the winter, especially in the northern latitudes? Reflection. A little bit. But that's not going to affect, that'll affect temperature, but not so much CO2 levels. We're burning a lot of fossil fuels to heat our homes. So we're putting out a lot of CO2 in the winter. So this actually shows the seasonal variation. I like it because it's basically my lifetime. I was born a year later, and in the 1980s, I was in a graduate program at Michigan State, and the lab was looking at, not my work, but some other people's work, what would happen if we increased CO2 to crop plants? It's an ag school. And so we were talking about climate change before that term even really was popular. And at the time, we were like, well, what happens if it ever got to 400 parts per million CO2? And everybody go, oh, it's never going to happen. And here we are, okay? And have been for quite a while. This is just backing it out a little bit, so that's that data I just showed you. Before that, there's other ways that we can look at CO2 in the atmosphere by looking at ice core data and a variety of ways that we can measure what CO2 was earlier. And you see for a really long time, CO2 levels were fairly stable. And so this increase here is relatively recent. I put Arrhenius in here. He was a chemist in the 1890s who published the first paper saying, you know, we're burning a lot of fossil fuels. That means we're putting CO2 out. I bet you it's going to get warmer. And he actually predicted how much he thought the temperature was going to increase, calculated by hand, no computers, no calculators, and he was right on. Okay. And then everybody goes, oh, but things have always changed. This is CO2 levels in the atmosphere on Earth going back to about 800,000 years ago. And you see this periodicity, and we know we've had ice ages and we haven't had ice ages and so on. We've had change in the past. But in 800,000 years, or roughly the time where humans came in around here, humans as we know them today, we have never seen CO2 levels higher than we have right now. So here's where we are today. Okay? There was just a paper that came out this week, and it actually, as much as I spend time looking at this stuff, I actually jumped. It said the last time CO2 levels were this high in the atmosphere, there were trees growing at the South Pole. And they know that from fossil records. There were types of beaches that existed at that time. It's a very different planet. Okay? Enough of that. What does that really mean in terms of our day-to-day life? This was from the 4th National Climate Assessment Report that came out in November on Black Friday. And what this shows you, basically if it's red, it means overall the annual temperature in that part of the country is warmer than the average of the 20th century, so from 1900 to 2000. So they took the average temperature, and then they're looking at what it is now, and so if it's the redder it is, the higher it is above that long-term average. If it's blue, it's actually a little bit colder, which is kind of interesting that we do have places in the south that are a little bit colder than they've been. If you look at winter temperatures, you can see that Pennsylvania has had much warmer winters than we did historically. Summer, there's a lot more variation. And often this is because we've had these really rainy events, these heavy rains that tend to cool things down, a lot more cloud cover and so on. But Pennsylvania is still warmer. This is projecting into the future. And so there's these models that you can use and you put in your city, and so I put in Kunkeltown, or actually Bethlehem. And projected by 2100, our average temperature now is about 82.8, and that's in Bethlehem. It's cooler up here in the summer. But by 2100, our summers will be an average of 93 degrees or more like southern Texas. In 2008, the Union of Concerned Scientists did a similar model, and they said we were going to be like Georgia. And just in that time, 11 years, the projections are it's going to be even a more dramatic temperature increase and much quicker than anybody expected. Okay? So whatever they fish for down here, okay, might be what you want to stock your streams with. All right. So, and I'll get to streams, I promise. But what we know is if we have more days above 90 degrees, we're going to have more health-related issues, heat stroke, allergies, and so on. Poorer air quality, and you're already seeing that in the Lehigh Valley. I love coming home over the mountain because the air is so much cleaner after a day of work. It's going to affect what we grow agriculturally in this area. Apples need cold winters to set their fruit. Cows can't produce a lot of milk in hot weather. Trees that we're so used to in this area, birches and sugar maples and so on, will not be able to survive here anymore. That southernmost line is actually shifting northward. Lots of changes in our bird life, and for those of you in the room, it could very much affect what kind of fish survive in our streams or not, and I'll come back to that point. And there's no coincidence that Blue Mountain and Camelback have put in these water parks and recreation that they can do year-round so that they can make money because their ski season is getting shorter and shorter. And that, of course, the decreased snowpack will have an impact on watersheds. So that was a national report, and some things focus on the United States. There's equivalent reports that come out from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and I don't want to dwell on this, except in the 2007 report, they did something kind of stunning. They talked about phenology, and they talked about citizen science. So this is a group of world experts who look at all the published data in the world on climate change, and they decided to say, you know, citizen scientists, people like you in this room who collect data, are providing some of the most important information about how ecology is shifting with this climate change. And so they talk about all of these phenology events. Chorusing of amphibians is your spring peepers, okay? Emergence of butterflies and so on. And they've been able to figure out that we have, depending on where you are latitude-wise, somewhere between 2 to 5 degrees earlier spring in the northern hemisphere. Okay? Longer growing seasons for the gardeners in the room. Okay. The U.S. National Phenology Network is a whole group of organizations working together. Several of them are national agencies, but there's a lot of universities and nature centers and so on, and promote phenology on very specific things. They'll say, okay, let's look at these plants or these plants, and there's very specific protocols to follow. It's a bit cumbersome, but they're finding some really interesting information out. And one of the things that they did, this was from 2017, they took data that they had collected from people all over the country. Now, this is not the official scientists. These are people just in neighborhoods and nature centers and so on, looking at spring leaf out, so like that oak tree that I showed you earlier, and could predict how much earlier spring was coming based on how much earlier the leaves were coming out. And so the darker the red, the deepest red here says 20 days earlier. If it's blue, it means it's later, and you can see how much earlier spring by that one measure is happening in much of the United States. Okay. Another way of projecting this, anywhere where it's orange means the spring came earlier than the long-term average from 1900 to 2000. If it's blue, it was a later spring, and you see earlier predominates over the last several decades. Okay. For the gardeners in the room, you might know about the hardiness zones. You know, you pick your plants based on where you live. And in 1990, when this was first developed, your guys are up here in the darker green, zone 5. They had to adjust it in 2006 because the zones had shifted. And so now the darker green is gone, and yellow has moved into Pennsylvania. It used to be Virginia. I live just over the mountain ridge. I can grow crepe myrtle in my yard, which is supposed to be a Cape May plant. Okay, so we're probably getting closer to zone 7 or 8 in our area in the southern part of the county. And then they had to change it again in 2012, and unfortunately they switched the colors. But they broke, and it's not quite focused. I don't know if there's a way to do that on here. Ooh, no, don't do that. I'm not going to touch it because I'm going to go that one. Anyway, they divided it much more finely because we're seeing more and more microclimates. Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about this project and how you can really help out. So in 2010, I was awarded a Together Green Fellowship from the National Audubon. And they wanted us to do a project related to something involving nature, something involving conservation. And we were at the time in a state that was not allowed to talk about climate change. Any official agency, we had a governor who said, you cannot say the word or the term climate change. And I wanted to be able to have conversations about what's changing, but I didn't want it to be politicized. I didn't want it to be controversial. I wanted people to think about what's happening in their backyards. And I also wanted to get my students disconnected. I wanted them to get out and see things. And so this project was born. And the idea was that it was going to be a partnership of a variety of groups, not unlike the ones in this room. It was going to be educational. And yes, we were going to collect data, but it was more about creating conversation. These were some of the initial partners, and you can see there's a wide range of organizations involved. from the Lehigh Gap Nature Center, which is kind of our home base, if you will, some of the national projects, but a whole bunch of the state and federal agencies and state parks and so on. And so it was a really fun to get a lot of people together thinking about how we might want to do this. And so we put out a call, and actually in the parks, if you went to Jacobsburg or some of the areas around, we had these wanted posters and things that we wanted people to be paying attention to. And we put different ones out at different times of year. So we were looking, in the urban centers, we were looking for when's the first dandelions, because we could get school kids to do that. When do you first see whatever? And then also, do you have any data that you've collected in those journals that I was talking about earlier, your notebooks? And the very first year, almost 13,000 pieces of data got submitted to this project. We were a little overwhelmed. We didn't quite expect that. And then people also gave, like one person, you mentioned Terry Master, he brought me these boxes of file cards that he had basically written since the 1960s about when he would see birds. And they're all in this code. And I've known Terry for over 30 years. His handwriting is awful. But anyway, he donated them. He said, here you go, if you can interpret them. And so one of the benefits of having students is they can take all that and put it into spreadsheets. It kept them busy for a while. And some people gave me these beautiful photoshopped things, and they were taking pictures of things budding out in their yard for seasons and having great fun with it. 95% of the data had to do with birds. So if any of you know Terry, or if any of you know a birder, birders are fanatic about keeping records because they're incredibly competitive. They want to know their life list, and they want to make sure their life list is better than the other person's life list. But that's really good for data, okay? So besides all of the bird data, we got information on 185 plant species, insects, mammals, and so on. And somebody actually kept records of when slugs came out in their garden, when they first saw slugs. So who would have known that you keep track of that? Lots of kids like to pay attention to earthworms because you first see them on the sidewalk in the spring after the rains and so on. This is the woman from along the Saucon Creek in South Bethlehem or Center Valley, and she was documenting daily the changes, for instance, on the redbud tree. And she's been doing this every year, and so I have these gorgeous records that are not like your typical scientific notebook entries, but they're wonderful. And she looked at a whole bunch of things because she's very concerned about the watershed and what's happening there with the development that's happening. And in that area, it's suburbia development, housing development. She also, when did she find eggs? When did she see caterpillars laying eggs or emerging and so on? She really, I mean, she literally every year brings me a notebook like this of these gorgeous pictures. So I mentioned birds as being the primary data, and that's really good because birds are very good indicators. You've probably heard the term canary in a coal mine. They tell us a lot about what's happening in the environment. And there's a lot of data that's been collected for a long period of time through citizen science. So the Christmas bird count has been over 100 years. The eBird records, where people put in their lists, and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology keeps those records, and there's just tons of data. The Breeding Bird Atlas is a little bit more formal monitoring protocols. And so this is that first year of data. All of this was bird data. A little bit of plants and then everything else, okay? So we decided, what do we do with the bird data? What can we learn? So I'm going to pick one because it's a riparian zone bird, and it's of relevance to you guys. So this is the Louisiana water thrush. It nests in hemlocks along riparian zones. Very common along streams. Delaware Water Gap's full of these. And just for fun, I looked at eBird today, and one of the things you can do from eBird, so this is from Monroe County, this is the Louisiana water thrush, and this just shows you the bigger the bar is, it's the number of times people have put in entries for that species. And you should see right about now, we should start seeing this bird, and sure enough. The first one this year was April 7th, the most recent one was on the 9th. It tells me who did it. And then we see it through the summer, or hear it through the summer, and then they migrate south. A related species, the northern water thrush, comes a little bit later. And we see it again, often because ones that bred farther north are coming through again during migration in the fall. So these patterns will give you an overall idea of when this species might be around. But what we did is we got that data from eBird going back to the 1970s, and from people's records like Terry's locally, and plotted it out over time in terms of when was the first sighting for a given spring each year. For each of those years we had data. And again, this downward trend, like I was showing you before, means earlier. This bird was coming back about 3 weeks earlier in 2015, or 2011 rather, than it had in the 1970s. And somebody goes, yes, we get to see birds sooner. But that bird needs food when it comes back. It winters in the tropics. It flies a very long distance. It's totally depleted in terms of its energy reserves when it gets here. What we don't know is, are the insects along the riparian zone or the aquatic macroinvertebrates, are they hatching at the same 3 weeks earlier that this bird needs? Or is this bird coming back and going to die because it starves? We don't know. Okay? We do know that the numbers are in decline. That could be because of this. What do you know about hemlocks? They're not doing so well. Okay? The darn woolly adelgid, that fuzzy little thing that you see under, sucking the life out of that tree. And if you go anywhere, you see especially the lower branches are dying back, and a lot of the trees are coming down. If you go to Jacobsburg, a lot of them are mostly gone. That creates a number of problems. 98% of this bird nests that have been identified in Monroe County have been in hemlocks. That's Terry Masters' work and some of the students. If that tree's gone, this bird is losing its habitat. Okay? If that tree, one of the reasons, that woolly adelgid used to get killed off in the winter. 90-some% of it would die in the winter, the cold winter. If we have warmer winters, more of it survives and it does more damage. So these things are all kind of related, those ecological relationships I mentioned at the beginning. If those hemlock trees die and fall, what's happening to your streams? Warmer. That's a shade tree. It's also a tree that holds, they're often on slopes, so it holds the sediments and the soil from eroding into your streams. Okay? That tree is really important for all kinds of reasons. Okay? Whoops, back here. Charts at night, but I just want to tell you the bottom line. All of that bird data, we looked at it for 17 forest species, birds that breed in this area. And either eBird data or people that had given their records. And the bottom line here, everywhere you see a negative, that means it's coming back earlier. Every single species is coming back somewhere between about a few days to up to 3 weeks. But they're not all coming back, it's different. Okay, so there's this total mismatch in terms of timing that we see in nature. And these were all, this is distance of migration, so these are things that are coming from the tropics. There's a lot of really fun things you can do with this data. One of my favorite sites is Journey North, and it tracks things like hummingbirds, because everybody likes to know when should I put out my hummingbird feeder. Well, you can go on this site, and this is from today, because I was sitting in a boring meeting and I decided to look it up. And they're getting really close. Okay, so this is Delaware and Maryland. Here's the Pennsylvania border. I would say you should probably think about putting your feeders out this weekend, because they won't be far behind. And these are great teaching tools as well to do with kids, and they love to track. And you can put your own data in when you find the first. And so what I did, I walked outside this morning and I saw the first barn swallow scout. He was flying over. I heard it first and I went, what's that bird? What's that bird? And I looked up, I'm like, duh, it's a barn swallow. And we have a barn, so they tend to, but they usually send a scout and looking for places. So the first one I saw today, and I got to put the first Pennsylvania one in, okay? But these really give you a visual of what's happening over time, and then you can also look at how things change from year to year. And these are different things that they look at. So when is ice moving out on some of the lakes? And for the Great Lakes, that's really important, for instance. Okay. So things that you guys are interested in. As I mentioned, it's really important to learn about the insects. And we have very little data. Somehow people think that watching bear cubs or birds is much more exciting than timing insects. And we would love to have some information from fly fishermen or whoever about the timing of insect hatches and how that might be changing. You probably pay attention to the shad runs or other fish moving. We need to know that information. And there's not a lot of people providing documented records. And that, to some extent, we could get spring peepers and the movement of salamanders. Things like what's leafing out when along riparian zones, so we understand how that ecology is changing. Caterpillars that I mentioned for the feeding of the birds and other things. And then the timing of the last leaves that fall. And why would that be of interest to fishermen? This is something I learned by accident. In the fall, when leaves come down, we think about it, oh, winter's coming, or the color's over, or it's crunchy in the woods, or I'm going to pick it up for my compost. But leaves that fall in the streams are actually food for fish at that time of year. And the reason I found out by accident, because I work at the Superfund site, and the birch leaves are contaminated with the heavy metals, and we don't want those birch leaves going into the Lehigh River because they're spreading the contaminant around. But I never knew that about fish. But timing of that, because that's one of the last vegetarian food sources for fish, and it'd be interesting to understand that life cycle, how that's shifting. What can you all do? There's a lot, okay? How is the vegetative cover changing? I mentioned the hemlocks, but the invasive species, if you think about stream sides, Japanese barberry or whatever, what's changing? The phenology things that we've been talking about. What invasive species, and whether that's plants or insects, would be really important to know. The spotted lanternfly is getting all the attention right now, but there's a lot of other things. The flooding and the droughts. What's happening in terms of the hydrological cycle is going to be really, really important. The duration, last year, in case you didn't know it was really rainy, okay? That has an impact on riparian zone ecosystems. These invasive insects, as I've mentioned, understanding that and what's going to happen, but also because of the spread of disease. And I was at the Pennsylvania Academy of Science conference about a week and a half ago, and there's a new tick-borne disease, and for the life of me, I can't remember the name of it. But what scared me is, one is it's really serious, but two, usually like if you get a tick on you, you've got 24 to 36 hours before you get Lyme's disease. This one, 3 minutes. It can transfect the infectious agent in 3 minutes. And I was like, yeah, I saw the eyebrows. And then West Nile virus, understanding these kinds of things, predicting where are bad places for ticks, location kind of mapping, or where are you seeing changes in how the hatch times and so on, so we can warn people. The flooding, campus is right next to the Monocacy Creek, and if you ever spend any time in Bethlehem, we had a lot of flooding, especially in the historic district, and it always happens during Music Fest. Okay, but it also brings a lot of sediment, all of the stormwater runoff. It's amazing what gets dragged down, and I tend to walk down to the creek right from campus, and all the debris that ends up there. But that's rerouting streams. And then the stream temperature changes, which you're probably all aware of. I don't know if you know about the gauging stations, and this is something that a lot of you can look up, the U.S. Geological Survey, and all of these dots are places in Pennsylvania along waterways where we have gauges that measure a variety of things. And you can look this data up. You can just type in USGS gauging stations, or there's a number of things I'll show you in a minute. And what this particular map does is shows you, this was something to do with flow, and this was from today. And basically the idea is it compares it to long-term averages. So if it's green or in this 25 to 75 percentile range, and they define all that for you, this is about normal. So we're right now nothing too unusual. If you looked at this map last summer, after all those rains that we had, and again in the fall, we were in the much above normal because there was so much flooding. And oh, it's discharge. I can't see the heading here. If it's red, it means it's below normal, which means the river levels are down, and not too bad right now. Okay. Or let's see. That might have been, yeah. This is stream flow conditions, and this was as of today. This is the eastern part of the state. Again, we're kind of normal, but in here, the other one must have been something else. I'm sorry, I'm just blanking out because I couldn't see the label. This one's the stream flow. The streams out in the western part of the state are very low right now. Okay. And it wasn't snowpack. They had a lot of snow out there. One of the ideas is that this might be water that's being removed for fracking. And if you look at this map, where most of the fracking areas are in this area, the changing of hydrology that's going. Now, I can't prove that, and I'm sure lots of people would deny it if I asked them, but that's one of the hypotheses. Oops. The Lehigh Valley Planning Commission will take these, and they use it a lot because they're really worried about flooding. And I get calls from the morning call all the time. Music Fest flooded. Is it due to climate change? And it's that trick question, and I'm not sure how to answer really. And I'm like, well, we just had heavy rain, and we had a really unusual rainy season, but it's 1 year, it's weather, it's not climate. And they're like, should we move Music Fest? You know, and they mean time-wise or location-wise. And I said, I don't know. I said, maybe you should not maybe put in all those distribution centers and impervious surface, and they don't like that answer at all. But there's many things that are changing that causing changing in the hydrology. This is for the Minnesink Hills, so just off of 611. So one of the things when you go to these sites, you can poke on one of those dots, click on one of those dots, and it'll give you all of the flow or the discharge through that gauging station for the Broadhead Creek. I figured I'd do that one. This is the Brodhead Watershed Association. And this was the 6th, which was Saturday. I flew back from a conference on Friday, and it was pouring rain, it was really cold, and I think it was very nice, but it rained really heavy, and you can see them the next day, the discharge goes up. And so you can look at these patterns of what's happening to our flow of our streams, which if you're going to go fishing, and if that peak was really high and fast, it's probably quite dangerous. Okay? So let me show you what you can do with this. So I had a student a few years ago who looked at a number of sites in the Land Valley, because that's where we're located. And some of these there's data that go way back, some of them to the early 1900s. And she was looking at these sites because these are creeks that they're thinking about removing dams. And that was one of the reasons we were interested in that. And she looked at from Walnut Port then down to Bethlehem in terms of different state or gauging stations along the way. And she's looking at these peaks. So in the spring, when the river levels are high, partially because of snow melt and the April tends to be rainy, and she did it sort of these 5-year blocks, how long does that river stay high? And so basically the higher the bar here, the longer that river was running high. And one of the things you see over time is that seems to be going up. We have higher water flows in the spring. That's probably not due to snowpack, because if you took snowpack over that same time period, it probably does this. It's heavy rainstorms. If you go down to the Monocacy, or this is the Lady High River, Monocacy looks very similar. There's a fluctuation and then this kind of peak. But those are the kind of things that development planning people are looking for because they're really wondering what to do with the historic district and so on. So we see changes. You can look at countrywide. So this one, this is as of today, the stream flow. This is flooding, and you've heard a lot about the flooding that's occurring along the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers this year. And Nebraska got hit really hard just recently. But they said when the snowpack up in the upper Midwest goes, it's going to be a bad flooding year. And all of those black dots are meaning high flood potential coming now. They're having a major snowstorm right now. I grew up there. I know it's like. But they're really worried because they have that heavy snow. And then what often happens is we go these really quick warm-ups and heavy rains, and that combination is really bad. But these allow you to kind of monitor what's happening. Trout, interestingly enough, again, that western PA is experiencing drought conditions based on the stream data, and whether that's truly a weather or climate event or whether it's something else going on, I'm not really sure. So with that, what I wanted to leave you with is the role that you can play, whether it's being outside and collecting observations, things that you have in your records from gardening or fishing or just paying attention to the stream health. Sharing that data gives us a lot of information that we can start making better plans and understanding the changes. I don't think I tend not to be a doom and gloom person. I tend to think of what can we do to make things more resilient? How can we plan better? What can we plant instead of hemlocks that's going to be a little bit more resilient, but protect the streams, protect the wildlife? What can we do in those kinds of senses? But without information, we can't make good management decisions. So with that, I'll leave it open for questions.
I have one. Yeah. You showed us a bunch of data, and a lot of people in this room will actually do collection of bug data.
That's what I was hoping.
Yeah. What I'm wondering is why weren't you able to collect that somewhere already to add to? I mean, I saw what you're doing with the phenology project, but we don't see 100 years of mayflies in the
And I think
Brohead
it's just
or whatever.
who did we reach out to?
And I think what we did the first time, we said, okay, let's think about who would come out on kind of an initial call that might have some information or be willing to participate. And largely you reach out to people you know in your network on the developers. And then a lot of gardeners who want us to work. But and so that was the data I got, and it was people who I didn't necessarily, or some of the people that were kind of sitting around the table who we didn't think to ask. So one of the reasons I like coming to different groups is because I know the data's out there, I know people collect it. It's just how can we get it together and have conversations about what does this information tell us.
Now, in a collection of data relating to acid precipitation in the atmosphere in regards to, I'm hearing a lot of people report, and I've seen it as well in my house, of the increase of moss in lawns. Tremendous amounts, more so than I've ever seen.
So there's probably two things happening. We've had problems with acid rain or acid deposition for quite a while because of the coal burning process, the release of sulfur dioxide. It actually went down a little bit because of some of the air quality regulations that we put in place, not mostly, but in the federal government level. And, you know, like the zinc smelter in Palmerton and stuff, stopping operations, putting in scrubbers and stacks to control sulfur dioxide. So for a while, emissions of this acid-producing compounds went down. That's back on the rise again. And one of it's still residual coal burning in the state. And West Virginia and Kentucky because of the way the weather patterns blow, so it's blowing over eastward. The other thing is the more CO2 you put in the atmosphere, the more it combines with water to form carbonic acid, which is not nearly as bad as sulfuric acid in terms of causticness, but it also lowers pH. And I think we're starting to see the cumulative effects of the CO2 lowering. You hear about it in terms of ocean acidification all the time. The oceans take a lot of that CO2 and absorb it. But what you don't hear is what is the streams, what are the wet areas and areas where you have high water tables, or vernal pools or whatever, how are those being affected? And I looked today because I was thinking about this, and I discovered the effect on stream pH. And probably, but a lot of people are talking about SMOS. And so with this heavy rainfall, pulling that CO2 out, lowering the pH, you can test the soil and you probably guess it's probably pretty acidic around here. And then we've got the kind of geology, if you will, that doesn't buffer that very well. That's my suspicion.
So are you and your students still actively collecting data? And if so, how could this audience get it to you?
So there's my, we used to use the Lehigh Gap Nature Center, but they changed their website, and I figured it's just easier for it to come directly to me. So the answer is yes. And I have to find the right set of students because it involves a lot of fancy work with spreadsheets and stuff. But they're really interested in this kind of stuff, especially if they feel like it's something that's going to make a difference. And so if you have, and what I would say, if you have information that you think might be useful, just don't send it all to me first. Send me an email saying, this is what I have, and then I can tell you the best way to get it to me. If you have notebooks where you just kept things in those, we can copy those and get them back to you. I gave Terry all of his cards back when we were done with them because I really didn't want them, and he did. But so we can make digital copies, and then students can get the right amount of data or the right set of data or an interesting question that we want to ask. I can put students on this. And when the first project, we just took a couple students who wanted to do this as a project individually. Now what we've got is some faculty in the department who want to do this as a class exercises. So they do it as understanding ecology or climate change, and so you get the whole class working on something like this over a semester. So, and you know, like I put some of the things I think that was interesting. Not that because I didn't think it didn't exist, but I think we just didn't reach out to the right groups initially. So, yeah.
Just a comment, Board, we have data. Brodhead Watershed Association, which is a Green Marsh program, has in some spots almost 20 years of pH temperature data throughout the watershed. It was sporadic breaks in between. That's probably why Bob had asked that.
Well, I'm also thinking, I know fishermen, that they, you know, they got their notebooks and
Yes, absolutely.
regarding their favorite
Yeah,
spots.
I always hear it anecdotally. Man, the mayfly hatch was different this year.
Yes.
You know, it comes out that way. And I'm thinking, well, they must either have it in here or they have it written down somewhere.
And also Trout Unlimited is addressing the impacts of climate change ways that we can mitigate the effects of it as far as stream restoration projects, projects repairing plantings. So that's something Trout Unlimited nationally is really addressing and taking seriously right now, is ways to mitigate some of these impacts.
Yep. And that's, but having the knowledge of thinking about where are the areas that are impacted now, where do we have 10 years to maybe, prioritize, because you can't do everything at once. That's why the information can be so valuable. So if we see an area where there's a huge hemlock die-off, for instance, or a huge invasion of X, those might be areas that we kind of want hotspots to do something quickly, as opposed to, well, this looks pretty good, or whatever, or just go, oh my God, there's problems everywhere, we can't do.
Have you seen any, excuse me,
No, go ahead.
have you seen any data on the periodicity of Arctic increase or decrease or over the thousands of years?
In terms of the sea ice?
Yeah, on ice age.
Yeah, and I don't have it in this presentation. I teach a climate change course, so you can find areas where you've seen the sea ice or other characteristics of the Arctic that have changed over time in terms of depth of ice, in terms of extent of how far south it travels. So that's available. What we do know now is that the sea ice is declining, and it's declining faster than it ever has. So again, I think one of the things is that while there's this periodicity in a lot of things in nature, one of the things is we are changing things quicker than we've ever done before, and we're not sure how fast things can respond. So, if you think about, okay, after an ice age and everything retreated, obviously there wasn't probably a lot of things here, in this area. You think of Mortanders, Milwaukee's or something. When the ice first scraped away, it was probably pretty barren. Things came back. That's actually a good sign of hope, but that occurred over a very long period of time, and the changes occurred over a very long time. Now when we're changing things in decades instead of hundreds or thousands of years, that's what's got people a little bit like, we're not sure what's going to happen here. So.
There's some interesting data on the sudden surge in planetary heat that occurs before an ice age. And that's happened periodically. So it's associated more with sun stars.
Right.
It's borne out with research.
Right. Yeah, and it's a different presentation than I do, where I have a lot more of that kind of data. But again, if you look at how long does that occur over, you're talking a 10,000 year cycle or 20,000, there's different ones, 44,000. What we're seeing now is in decades, things are changing.
You mentioned about the runoff there, and to your point about a lot of development going on, that there's a lot more asphalt out there, and what I think we've seen in this area anyway is because even to the fact that somehow we've got to convince sometimes our government organizations that that's our zoning and this is what's required. Even out at the Kettle Creek, there was when that was built, there was a controversy about having a gravel parking lot versus having it paved, and it didn't make a lot of sense to have it paved, but all those things help. And also thank you for making me think that I'm not weird, because I always track in my head the emergence of skunk cabbage.
Yes.
So
Yeah, it's one of
I'm
the
a wag job. Oh, it's a little early this year. What was last year?
no, it's one of the earliest plants because of all the cool biochemistry it does
Yes,
to generate
yes.
heat. And as a plant scientist, there's all kinds of cool things going on. But yeah, but no, it's not weird at all. And people have their things. If it's something in their yard, like for me, because the barn swallows nest in our barn, I'm always watching for that. When are they going to be in there? Because it's fun to go in there and have them sing that
I had one cruising at the eve of my house before I came over here looking, scouting out for a
Right.
spot.
The other thing you start to notice that has nothing to do with climate change completely are, there's not as many up, So if any of you keep feeders in your yard, did you notice that winter birds seem to be down this year?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm not crazy. Probably West Nile. West Nile was very bad in the state last year. The very first round we had of West Nile back in the early 2000s, I think it was, we lost a lot of corvids, the crows and the blue jays. There was that, you could walk up along pipeline clearings and see just dead crows. And if any of you remember Jane Hoffman, who's the Baby Stroudsburg, her and I would go out and we're like, this is crazy. We didn't know what it was, and then they did testing and she found it was West Nile. The ones that are around now were resistant or developed immunity to, so their crows are doing just fine, okay? But the songbirds, titmice in particular, seem to, the chickadees a little bit, seem to really be down on the hypothesis, and some of the testing they did on blood samples seem to be less on. And that has nothing to do with climate change, except the rain. Yeah, right.
Even if you start watching them, because the emergence of acorn seems to have a pretty dramatic effect on birds and mammals and populations from year to year too. Like years when there's bumper crops of acorns, years when there's scarce.
Yeah. And you know, there's always those kinds of cycles too. There's those years where you just have a real heavy mast, you know, set. But look at the forests and look at the oak tree conditions. They are not doing well. They got hit for a couple of years with gypsy moths. They've been hit by, because the ones on the ridge, I live on Chestnut Ridge, which is just north of Clifton Ridge, got hit with acid rain, got hit with all, you know, the Palmerton, all of our oaks are dying. And then you got the ash borers and everything else coming in too. The forests, at least in the southern part of the county, the non-hemlock ones look absolutely horrible right now. And I'm really kind of worried. And then you've got deer browse, so, which has, again, that's a whole other issue. So anything that tried to come up is just moving down.
I'm curious about first sightings and how you interpret them. If you have, say, 6 people in the same general area, you have different dates or times for first sightings. How do you interpret them so that it's scientifically significant?
So this is a really good question about citizen science in general. So what we did for that bird study that I was talking about is we looked at Monroe, Carbon, Lehigh, and Northampton counties separately and picked the first dates that we saw, the earliest date we found in the records that somebody had reported. Now there's all kinds of issues with that because it could have been maybe the birds were there and you didn't have time to get out that day, you know, things like that. But went through, and there's ways you can set up pivot tables and stuff to pull out that kind of data. And just picked it and said, all right, that's the first study for that year, recognizing that there's a lot of variation possibility, a lot of error in there. But over decades, if you look at trends and you saw the scatter, what we're looking, you basically do linear regression and look at sort of statistical analysis to figure out, if I say that there's an advance or a change of 5 days or 21 days, is that plus or minus what? You know, so we look at deviation and stuff like that, figure it out. And it's just giving us a trend. It wouldn't say it's exactly 21 days. There's no way you can do that. It just gives us a hint that about 3 weeks earlier, but there's a lot of variation. When you look at, if you take eBird data or that data they showed you for like the National Phenology Network, with the leaf out that showed like the deeper reds in its earlier spring, those are hundreds of thousands of data points, and so you can start to do pretty good statistics and see where the where the outliers are. But one year or just one person, it wouldn't tell you very much because there's so much error in that. Like today, I just happened to be out when that barn swallow was there today. I mean, it might have been there yesterday, and I didn't get out that early.
Have you ever seen any data on macro invertebrates and how was that collected, and did they do it by stage of the insects at all?
That's not my area of expertise. So the water, our water ecology folks, they would be the ones to ask. But I'm sure, I know with like plants and what I've seen in terms of like the National Phenology Network, what they do is they actually have guides and they say, okay, if it's at this stage of a leaf bud, we're going to count at this, or if it's this stage of the cherry blossom, it's going to look like this, and they've got pictures, and here's what peak means, and they actually have photos. My guess is the macroinvertebrates is the same thing in terms of this is this stage of development. And I know that a lot of I remember the first time I went out with somebody that they had the kick nets where you pick up these various, and I went, that's the larval stage of mayfly, or that's a larval, or whatever it was, because I had no idea, it was just not my world. And, but people who know that will know which stage that they're looking at. And there's all these indicators about, because they use macroinvertebrates for water quality, and there's certain things that'll grow, midges will grow in kind of anything, no matter what the quality of the water is. Some of your dragonfly larvae and stuff can be higher quality water conditions and so on. And that's not my area, so I can't totally, but I'm sure people who do that will know. And if that kind of data comes to me, it's not going to be doing analysis. I'm going to turn it over to the folks who are the street ecologists.
Do you have anything to add to that?
I'm an aquatic biologist, so,
Yeah.
I mean, tracking the stages of aquatic insects, it can be done in a lot of different ways. I did a study where we measured head capsule widths under a microscope to track growth. But I don't have data as to trends over a long time. But certainly we're seeing emergences of mayflies some years way earlier than they used to be, because that can be predicted by degree days. Yeah.
And that's the same with plants. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
you know, degree days and sometimes like the cherry blossoms, it depends on the average temperature in February, you know, and things like that. Plant people used to think it was day length, but it's a lot more complicated than that.
I was just going to mention that for the stream gauges in Monroe County, the Monroe County Conservation District website has a quick link to those just in Monroe County. If you're interested in watching them or looking at those.
Yep.
So that's all the time. Yeah, just a comment that I know that the method that we calculate stormwater runoff for construction sites is somewhat being compromised because of the frequency and intensity of storms that we have now. And I know Penn State was working on a new model to better calculate stormwater based upon new characteristics and what have you. I don't know the status of that. I was wondering if you know anything about that.
I don't. I mean, I know that there's been concern that the way we used to do that kind of stuff, and it may not be it may not be the best way anymore. And I remember that student that had done those kind of averages of peak frequency and stuff. She looked at a lot of different methods and just said, okay, I'm going to pick one and just try to see, do I see changes in that? But you can look at it real time, but it doesn't seem a lot of people doing that I know of anyway is taking a long-term look and look at what's changing. And one of the things she found, I didn't have all of it, she did a whole thesis on it. The Little Lehigh might behave very differently than the Monocacy and stuff. And so there's other issues going on beside just stormwater runoff or, you know, the heavy rain events. We do know that the frequency of those heavy rain events is greater, but all the streams are not behaving the same way. So that could be the development, the impervious surface, it could be who knows what land use change and so on. Could be having to do with other characteristics inherent in the stream.
Well, it's interesting because what it does is it compromises the structural DMPs that have been in place on development sites over the last 20 years. In fact, they were designed in a certain way, and now the storm characteristics are different. You start seeing a lot more failures and controls that were in place for and maintained properly.
It's interesting that you said that because this morning I was listening to WHYY on the way in, and they were talking about all the row homes and the construction standards that were in place when those were built, so probably in the 20s to the 40s-ish. And now when people are going to do renovations, especially if they're doing anything in the cellar, the supporting walls, they're not concrete-based, they're based in sand. And the person, I was stunned because it was like not what you expect at 7:30 in the morning. He goes, well, due to the different storm patterns, due to climate change, we have to change our construction standards. And I was like, I just hear that on the radio at 7:30 in the morning. But there's that, because what they've had 5 collapses in the last 2 weeks of people like in one of the house units doing something and often apparently without permitting. And then the whole structure collapses. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of these issues that you have to think about doing things differently.
This is a weird chronology question, but Lydia supposedly came up with a 4 o'clock where you could tell what time of day it was by observing. Has there been any research done like on individual flowers when they open? Are those times changing, getting earlier or later? Or?
They have, and you know what? I never connected it to that clock because it probably doesn't work anymore. And you know, I had those sayings, you do this when this happens, and like the farmer's almanac and things like that. Those don't hold true anymore. And they're like, gotta rewrite some of these things. My guess is his clock isn't working so well anymore. But yeah, bloom times in general, in spring, are earlier. In the summer, it's all over the place because a lot of summer plants depends on rainfall, and that's been kind of goofy to some, you know, things that are bloom later in the season. Goldenrod last year, and I pay attention to it because we do all the monitoring. We're looking at goldenrod in terms of what it's taking up the metals. And I said, oh, the student, you don't have to go out till August. And I happened to go out in July, and the goldenrod was blooming in July. I'm like, wait, that's why they call her up. I'm like, we have to go here now. Because we were trying to figure what happens to the metal uptake over a season, right? That goldenrod blooms in August, and there's multiple species. But but nobody's really looked at it. It's easy in the spring because everybody's paying attention. They want to know their daffodils and prices and stuff like that, or their vegetables. When do I get my first tomato? Those kinds of things people pay attention to. But goldenrod and things like that, people haven't so much.
Have you ever given this presentation to any groups of policymakers? And if so,
I have. Not quite in this format, but one of the things in my introduction, I do work at the UN level and at the Science Policy Interface. And in those venues, if you will, and I've done a lot of the state level, the scientific community has very much taken the stance of, we will try to present the data. I'm going to put it up there and I'm going to show you what's changing, what I'm observing, what's being measured, what groups of people are measuring. I'm not going to interpret it for you. I'm not going to tell you. I know, and that's and the scientific community said, we're going to put the best data out there, make sure it's in front of them, but it's not our role to advocate or be an activist or whatever. That's been kind of to keep science pure and unbiased. It's too late for that. I truly believe that we have to start making it. Now, I'm not going to be the person carrying the sign, but I think it's time to start taking a pretty strong stands. And last year, for the first time, and I've been going to UN climate meetings for 10 years, there's a research and independent, and the independent's there for a reason, NGOs, non-government organizations. Their stance has been not to take a stand, they finally did. And what triggered that is when the IPCC report for it's a long story, but the 1.5 degree report that came out was actually commissioned by all the governments in the world to say, the Paris Agreement says we're going to try to hold temperature warming to 2 degrees or less Celsius. Somebody said, that sounds so good if you're a small island nation, because sea level rise based on that is going to put some, that's a death sentence for some people. So we need scientists to take the data and figure out what would happen, what would it take to get to 1.5 degrees, how much time do we have, and that report came out in the fall. The United States, Saudi Arabia, the Soviet Union, and Kuwait said, we're not going to accept that report. No vested interest there. And if they don't accept it, because everything by UN policy has to be consensus, it could not be used in negotiations. And finally, the scientists said, enough. You cannot reject. This is science, from thousands of scientists around the world. And that group actually stood up for the very first time and said, no, this data is telling you not only this, but it means you have to do X.
Well, just to encourage you, I was a policymaker and for a long time and had studies done in Monroe County where we bring scientists into the USGS and all that. And one of the hardest things for me as a policymaker was to get the scientists to support a policy that was developed by non-scientists as a result of the science that they had paid with public funds to develop. And it was very frustrating for me.
There's this huge gap now, for all kinds of reasons. There's some scientists who are like, just don't bother with me, I just want the data out. There's other scientists who are like, I'm not going to talk to them because they're stupid, I don't want to be bothered because they're not going to understand anyway. Or if a policymaker comes and says, here's a policy, can you tell us how does this work with the science? They're like, that's starting to change in some circles. But it's still, we got a way to go.
Because policymakers get it from one side that has access.
Right.
The scientific community does not have access. The door needs to be open for them to be able to have access.
I completely agree. And I think the best place, and I sat on some of the state, like there was a climate action adaptation group related to wildlife, natural resources, and stuff like that. But that was sort of the agency people, and so I was thinking about the legislation to keep the legislators separate from that. Right. But working at the city level, or the municipality level, is a really great way to have conversations. And so I'm working with the city. They're putting together a climate action plan, and we're having conversations all the time. Even though I'm not from Belmont to actually listen to it. But, and then bringing students, and they're having students, help them, kind of that modeling there. Well, this is what we're proposing, what would that do for this, and so on. And so I think at some levels it would be very, very effective, but it doesn't happen enough.
All right. Well, maybe that's a good segue to the local committee here then, because I think there are opportunities on all kinds of levels to affect change.
A couple years ago, I brought all this, because there's a lot of colleges and universities in the Lehigh Valley that are all very close to each other, and I brought all the people that are doing something with climate change or environmental or watershed work together and said, we should put together a group that puts out an offer to the local municipalities, planning commission, city, and so on, that we could be resources. And they're like, literally, the whole room of people went, that's not our area. And I'm like, seriously, guys? And I'm like, from the Midwest guys.
Do you think that's because of the intense polarization around an issue like this one? Like people are like, oh, that's too polarized, so I don't want to be involved in that.
I don't think it was initially. I think for climate change it has become that fear of stepping into a trap kind of idea, because it has become polarized, politicized. And darn it, let's just have conversations. Even if you and I disagree, let's sit down and talk about it instead of going, oh, you're in that category, you're that box, that's stupid.
How much, I don't expect a full answer on this, but when you're looking at politicians ignoring kind of policy, or making bad policy and ignoring kind of data, do you see it more as a lack of scientific literacy or a problem with private money influencing decision making?
It depends. And so I can speak best at the international level. In the US and some of the developed industrialized nations, lobbying efforts by the big corporations, the big money, that's who's in the room. This year, well actually the last 2 years, the Trump administration, instead of bringing the State Department scientists and the EPA and the NOAA and the NASA folks, brought people from the coal industry to the front lines. I think that speaks volumes. In countries that are less developed, it's access to the information, and they are very hungry to get the science. But what's really heart-wrenching to me is the State Department used to go to these meetings, and they have these country pavilions. So countries set up and they have some display. And the United States used to bring NOAA and NASA and the State Department to show off because we have the best science data on climate change in the world. From satellite imagery, from modeling, you name it. And they were proud of it and they showed up, and people from other countries were just hungry to come to those sessions and learn on these really great, interactive spheres and stuff, because they didn't have access to that back home. The last 2 years, the United States has not had a put in there. And that, to me, to watch that change says a lot. And I'm trying not to politicize this. One of the things I do is I do work with a lot of countries. I'm on a task force on adaptation internationally, and we work with developing countries, or the global south, as they refer to it. They are, and they don't have access to computers usually, or there might be one computer every 20 miles or something, but cell phone technology is what they're using. As they said, solar charged phones. The communication, I was in Uganda 3 years ago, and I was just amazed. In the middle of absolutely nowhere, they're all getting weather data in 15 tribal languages interpreted by some local guy in the community. And they were showing me this, and that, like, they were talking about the changes in the rainy season because that was going to affect their planting. And what they were asking for, interestingly enough, was they were trying some what they call innovations in terms of agricultural practices. In order to get grant money to scale it up, they had to have proof that it was working, and they didn't know how to design a scientific experiment. And they asked that the UN put things on their webpage that was phone friendly, because all of the platforms on the websites, they couldn't get down on their phones. And it's like, so I'm on these calls, I'm the only American that was working, and they didn't know how to design a scientific experiment. On the call, and I'm telling all these people, like from the UN, like, your platform doesn't work on a cell phone in Uganda. Like somehow it took me from Pennsylvania to get to, that kind of thing. So it depends. Some people are really hungry, and those people have great access to their politicians. When they bring a contingent to the negotiating table, they've got kids, they have activists, they have women's groups, they have farmers, they have indigenous people. Their team represents the demographics of their country. We bring a bunch of people in suits. that are not necessarily any more sun. And that's really, really hard to watch. So, yeah.
As a naturalist and a botanist, I'm maybe dating myself a bit, but Yule Gibbons, in his books, he talked about that a weed was simply a plant out of place. So I like to not use the word invasive, because that's a similar situation. It is a plant that is here for some reason and it's prospering. But there are certain plants that explode very rapidly at times, and Japanese stilt grass, an example, lesser celandine now, or celandine. I mean, those are things that you didn't see in places here, and in 2 years' time, they're just everywhere. So is there any truth to, or any information that looks at carbon dioxide tipping points? So, we watch that rise of carbon dioxide, but somewhere in there must be triggers that are happening for plant species that allow them to all of a sudden prosper. Are we on track with?
There's a couple of things back in the early 80s when I was in grad school, one of the things they were looking at is C3 versus C4 plants. And if you're a botanist, you know that the metabolism of how they take in carbon are different. And there was what would happen with temperature and what would happen with CO2. And where would C4 plants start doing better or worse versus C3 plants? We've passed that tipping point. So one of the things, and often the weeds, okay, or the plant out of place, would have the competitive advantage if temperature and or CO2 got to a certain point. So I think you're right on there. The other thing is, other things start to crash, if you will, because of the temperature. And those other things may not have an advantage, except that now there's room for them to come in. So if you've got a bunch of plants that died and you've got a bare space or a disturbed space, they're like, we're good. Phenology of autumn olive. I'll call that invasive because I really hate that one. But it's the first thing to leaf out. The second thing is Japanese barberry. And if you go in the fall, it's the last thing that still has its leaves. So it's come up with some kind of competitive advantage in terms of its growing season. And you can actually track it through, they do the satellite imagery of photosynthesis, looking at chlorophyll levels and stuff. So from the atmosphere, they can see they can map where autumn olive is in the spring and the fall, because it's the stuff that still has photosynthesis going on. It's crazy. So, that plant has evolved to be incredibly smart in the current weather and climate conditions.
There are a lot of other factors, things like gypsy moth, which alter forests and forest composition. So we have dried out groundwater tables and dropped groundwater levels so that oaks prosper, and then that triggers an insect which comes in like gypsy moth that does that. But when the oaks disappear, then it changes the composition of the forest that may also allow a foothold for some of those C3 or C4 plants that you're talking about. So there are a lot of factors, but it just, the thing that you see a plant and in 2 years or 3 years' time, like European mugwort, okay, which is out competing crown vetch. I mean, that's that is. Mila minute vine, which is just now starting to get a foothold in Monroe County here, out competing Japanese knotweed.
You know what I think is in the shortest supply? We talk about biodiversity problems, is people with your background. Naturalists who really know how to identify those kinds of things. It's not taught in curriculum, to do taxonomy or identification. We had a curriculum at Moravian that still taught zoology and botany as a mandatory course. And the external reviewers came in and just shredded us for being ancient. And I'm going, who's going to identify all these issues, and ecosystems and climate change if they don't understand how to figure out a dichotomous key, or they don't get outside to actually do it because they're under working with their micropipetters and their genetics, and that's important too. And we really stuck to our guns on that to make sure that students are still getting that broad, they can decide to specialize. I can't make them become this or that, but And I've kind of embraced the technology like iNaturals or something because I'm not going to take their phones away. It's not going to, they don't know what they're going to do. But to use those tools to get them outside measuring things because they get a real kick out of taking a picture of something, sending it up, and then some expert can identify it for them, and they're like, oh, I got a response from Dr. Whoever, and you know, whatever. That really gets them excited. And I thought, if that's what it takes, okay, bring your phones, you know. But then we go back and say, okay, how about if you learn how to identify that? You know, so the next time you find something, they love to map invasives. There's a iMap invasives project in Pennsylvania, and they'll go to an area and go, hey, there's nothing about this species here. I'm going to put the first dot on the map, and we love seeing that instant kind of gratification, like, okay, that's what it is.
Well, 1800s, early 1900s, naturalists were held in pretty high esteem because of their broad view of the environment, but we've pigeonholed science and scientific knowledge to the point where blinders and narrow views, and so you have to be a specialist in something.
I guess it's always on TV. That's a problem. But it's bucking the trend. I mean, it's, you know, and students like, I don't want to take botany plants are stupid. I don't want to take, you know, the zoology maybe because they might get to some cool animals.
Just one other note. So we've observed along the Broadhead here. I've made some notes about it, but beaver are starting to eat knotweed. Okay, so they cut it and then they eat off the tender tips. And I thought at first it was just, you know, serendipitous, you know, they were messing around because they're just chewing to keep their teeth from growing too much. But they've actually done that. But so that across 5 generations or 6 generations is what generally is perceived as the amount of time it takes for adults to teach their children to be able to use that as a food source. So, you know, are we able to see examples like that where the natural world is adjusting to food sources?
There are, and for good and bad. And I'll go back to my favorite one, olive. Full of little orange berries later in the season. Cardinals have started to eat those berries as a food source, for better or worse, because that spreads the seeds more. But it's changing their pigmentation. And the male cardinals are more orange, and the females don't like the orange males. So there's all these studies now about what happens to the reproductive strategies of orange cardinals versus, and it's subtle, but I mean, if you look at, does that cardinal look more orange? But apparently females can detect that. Sometimes the nutritional value, so one of the invasives that we have at the Superfund site is butterfly bush. Just goes crazy out there. And it has, the butterflies, yeah, it's called that for a reason. They love it, especially in the fall, the migrating butterflies. Somebody did the nutritional analysis of the nectar. It's awful, I know, because one of the things that the coevolution is that plants evolve to have, like, you know, the berries that come out in the summer, so blackberries and blueberries and things like that, that birds will eat, will have the right amount of sugars because those are fast growing, the young have to grow and kind of build. But as you move towards the fall, those birds need to put on fat before they fly, and so they go to sources like nuts and stuff that come out later that are high in oils. So this has all been, all this synchronous timing, and if now we're putting out, you know, autumn olive that's got these nice sugary berries, tastes good, but it does nothing for those late migrant, or those fall migrants in terms of the nutrition that they have to keep. So there's all these questions that we don't truly understand yet.
Wait till deer eating barberry, eating the berries on there, because there's a reduction in the mass crop that's available for them. So they're eating barberry berries. You can see them stripping them off the barberries. So.
If you get a plant at a nursery like Bleeding Heart, does it have nutritional value for the hummingbird, or does it have to be, just have to be certain species of that plant? That's because I've heard, is it true some of those plants just have no nutrition for birds?
The more inbred something has become, and that's true of a lot of horticulture. Typically, you've bred something out, and often it's the nutrition. But in general, we haven't studied enough to know.
So if you're starting to get hybrids of a certain variety of plants, you're taking away.
Right. So trying to select for something, a big showy bloom, or, you know, one flower instead of lots of little flowers, or whatever it is, chances are the seeds, which would have been the food source, are diminished. You know, and a lot of these, you know, the whole propagation things, if you want the vigor, you know, and from a horticulture standpoint, you want big showy things, then it's taken away from, often, you can't take those seeds and plant them because they're not going to do anything. They have no ability to really germinate until they're planted. Or if you do get some throw back or something. But I think in general that the nutritional value hasn't been studied very well. It's just starting to look at a few of the basics to try to understand what might happen. And you made, somebody made, you made the comment about a weed is, you know, just, it's not appreciated. The Game Commission, in some of the game lands on the mountain, said, okay, we got to take care of the barberry. We have to get rid of it. It's horrible. And I said, well, yeah, but if you do that, there's nothing left. There's no lower level canopy. So let's first look at if there's any birds using that for nesting season. And it turns out that, if any of you know the hooded warbler, which is an absolutely stunning, beautiful bird, which typically didn't used to spend a lot of time in Monroe County, it used to be south, has decided that the Japanese barberry bush is the best place to nest because it's so protected, because of all the little thorns, and the hooded warbler poplar is soaring. If you took out that barberry, it would crash. So the birders are like, maybe we don't want to get rid of all that barberry. You know, that's the kind of thing, just who's going to adapt, and there's going to be changes, and all the changes may not be there, but we don't know. This is like the most interactive audience. This is awesome. Yeah.
I was going to, oh, and I don't want to pick up any interest in anybody else, but you could be pointing in direction of resources for kids. I'm a teacher, and I want to provide my students.
Yeah, how about you send me an email, I can send you a bunch of stuff. There's some, she asked about resources for kids. There's a lot of really great stuff about teaching kids about phonology. That Journey North site has, they have all kinds of really fun things for K through 12. That's one of my favorite sites actually for little kids. And you had a question.
This coincidentally just came up in my timeline.
Using citizen science to describe the prevalence and distribution of tick bite and exposure to tick-borne disease in the United States.
Yeah.
The last administration.
Last year I had my first tick in February.
Yes. Yeah, last year was bad.
Yeah.
The last administration of the White House actually put out a white paper talking about the importance of citizen science as a way to democratize science, but as a way to get all kinds of information that we don't have funding to get enough boots on the ground. We've gone to this, ecology is done at the desktop. You use all these satellite images, all this information coming from things that are out, it comes to your computer and you just sit. And I was just at a conference last week in Boulder at the University of Colorado Atmospheric Research Center, and they're like, we never get outdoors anymore. And then if you go out and ground proof what the satellite said, often the satellite information is not the whole picture. And we need boots on the ground. And there's no money to support that kind of research. So the more people we can engage and gather information, the better. And we all of us.
The original article that is from is called March of the Ticks, is Lyme disease spreading faster than we can stop. The first things about climate change.
Woo! It's all connected. Well, thank you very much. This has been fun.
Our climate change committee, some members are here, some are not, and the Brodhead Watershed Association for supporting our efforts in getting this committee launched and out there, and especially Trout Unlimited, who agreed, didn't have to twist any arms to co-sponsor this as their April meeting. Both great organizations, whether you fly fish or not, consider joining them, lend them your support. Really, really worthy for helping to protect our environment and water quality in Monroe County and the Brohead Watershed. And thank you so much for bringing this up here to us.